Hello and welcome to our fourth and final module for the Adult Consumer Survey Refresher Training. In this module, we will review Section 2 of the Adult Consumer Survey. So starting out with just a few reminders of protocol for conducting Section 2 of the survey. First, this part of the survey can be conducted with a proxy respondent. However, it's always preferable to have the individual answering these questions when possible. If the person is going to have a proxy respondent help with these questions or answer the section for them, we want to make sure that the proxy is somebody who knows the person well and who knows their daily activities. A reminder here as well, the proxy respondent cannot be the person's case manager or service coordinator. For every question in Section 2, we have a respondent box, so we ask who is answering the question, and we ask that be filled out for every question. If the individual and a proxy respondent are answering questions together, if they both give the same answer, you can go ahead and mark off that the individual gave the answer in the respondent box. If the individual and the proxy have a different answer, we ask that the interviewer follow up with some questions to try to find agreement between both individuals. However, if the proxy and individual cannot come to an agreement, the question can be checked off as a non-response, a don't know or unclear response. As usual, we are starting out Section 2 with the community inclusion section. We have a definition here of what we're looking for these questions, and this can be read to the individual, or a summary of this can be told to the individual before starting this section. Briefly, what we're looking for are activities that have been done in the past month with or around other individuals who do not have disabilities. You may notice that these questions are slightly updated from previous years. So what we now ask is how often the person has gone out to do an activity in the past month. And you see here, how often did you go shopping in the past month? The response options would be 0, so not at all, or 1 to 2 times, 3 to 4 times, or 5 times or more in the past month. As always, we have that don't know response. We can also help the person gauge about how often they've gone out in the past month by using a 1 to 2 week window, so how often the person has gone out shopping in the past week or two, and multiply that by 2 or 4, and that would get your answer. We continue to ask who the person typically does this activity with. I want to point out that we no longer ask whether the person has gone out for exercise in the past month, although there is a question about exercise a little bit later in the survey. We did, however, add this question number 49. Do you participate in community groups or other activities in your community? And you see some examples here are church groups or other formal or informal community groups. And this here is just a yes or no response. Also, question 50, in the past year, did you go on vacation, is slightly updated. We ask this only as a yes or no question, so we no longer ask how many times the person has gone away on vacation. And just another note here on this vacation question, we are looking for a vacation that's taken place overnight. The next part of Section 2 goes into questions about choices and decision making. As usual, we have 3 different response options for each of these questions. First, that the person played a major role in making a decision. That may be that the person talked with other people before making a decision, but ultimately the individual made a choice by his or herself. It may also be that the person consulted with a spouse, and we would still code this as 2, the person played a major role in making the decision. The middle response here would be a 3 response. That means that the person had some input in making the decision, but did not play a major role in making a decision. And finally, we ask that you code 1 if the person did not have any input in making a choice. These questions have remained the same as in previous years, so I will just highlight some areas that we typically get questions around. So questions 51 and 52 have to do with where the person lives, whether the person chose their home, and if they chose their roommates, or if they chose to live by themselves. For both of these questions, we would mark not applicable if the person is living in their family home. The next set of questions are about decisions a person would make about their everyday life. So whether they decide their daily schedule, so things like when they get up, when they eat, or go to sleep. Also, who decides their free time, so if they're not working or in school or at a day program, are they able to choose what to do with their time? We then ask for people who are working if they chose their place of employment, and this is only for people who are in a paid community job, which you may know from Section 1. And then we ask whether the person chose or picked where they go during the day, and again, this is only for people who are in a day program or other activity during the day, which again, you may know from the Section 1 questions. We then ask if the person gets to choose what to buy with their spending money. And just a note here that middle response is slightly different than others. This is that the person has help choosing what to buy or that there are some set limits. These final two choice questions, did you choose your case manager or service coordinator, and did you choose your staff, again have remained unchanged from previous years. However, I do want to make the important note here that while we know most people would respond no to this question, what's really important is that follow-up, whether individuals know that they can request to change their case manager or their staff. So if the person does say that no, they were not able to choose their case manager or their staff, we want interviewers to follow up and ask whether if in the future the person wanted to change their case manager or their staff person, whether they would be able to request to have a new case manager or staff. And that brings us to questions about rights. You'll see that these two questions, number 60 and 61, have been added this year. These are reflective of the new HCBS regulations. So we ask whether the person has a key to their home and whether the person can lock their bedroom if they want to. We continue to ask whether individuals have ever taken part in a self-advocacy group, meeting, conference, or event. I do want to point out, since we've gotten a number of questions about this, we are looking specifically for self-advocacy groups focusing on disability rights. I also want to point out that middle response is that the person had an opportunity to go to a meeting or conference or event, but chose not to participate. Question 63 is new this year. We ask, have you voted? And this is if the person's ever voted in a local, state, or federal election. And similar to that self-advocacy question, the three responses that the person had an opportunity to register or vote, but chose not to do so. We then have a couple of questions about access to needed services and supports. Question 64 is slightly updated from previous years. This is now just one question that asks whether the person needs any of the additional services listed. And we ask that you read each of the 15 response options and check off each one that the person says yes to. A number of these questions or response options may need some definition for the person, and many of these may have some state-specific connotations that can be used to help the person better understand what you're asking. We then ask whether the person feels that staff have the right training to meet their needs. I just want to point out here that if staff are attending the meeting or if they are helping to answer these questions, this question should just be marked a 99 response to indicate that the staff is present or responding. We then have a couple of questions about health and wellness, and both of these questions have been moved from the background information section over to section 2, since we found that individuals or proxy respondents tend to have better information on these questions. So first we ask overall, how would the person describe their overall health? And I just want to point out that this should not be a point in time data, so if the person is getting over a cold, we're not looking for how they're feeling right then, but generally over the past several months, how has their health been? And it is okay to read off those response options of excellent, very good, fairly good, or poor. Then we ask question 67 whether the person exercises or does any physical activity, and we give a few examples of what we mean as well as a definition for physical activity. The response options here look at the frequency at which they do that exercise, so regularly, which would be 3 times or more, or sometimes, which would be 1 to 2 weeks, or not at all. The last part of section 2 is our self-directed supports module. Again, this is slightly different from previous years as we're capturing anybody who is using self-directed or participant-directed supports, not just those who are on a waiver. You can find out this information from pre-survey question 10 as well as the background information question. It's actually BI 51 to find out this information. But you would go ahead and ask whether the person is using self-directed supports. If it's a yes, you would follow up with whether the person who's answering participates in decisions about how to use the supports budget, hiring staff, or managing the services that they get. If the response to this is a no, you would go ahead and skip the rest of the questions in this self-directed supports module. However, if the person does participate in any of those aspects of decision making, you would go on to ask the follow-up questions. So we go on to ask the person, again, only if they are making decisions about their budget for services. Who makes decisions about how the budget for services is used? The response options here is that the individual mostly controls or makes decisions. The individual has input, but family or friends also help. That someone else makes decisions, so that maybe again a family member or close friend. Or that decisions about services that are received are made by a case manager or other professional employed by the state. We ask whether the person who's responding hires and manages staff, and give some examples of what that means. And then we ask whether the person can make changes to the budget or services if needed. We ask whether the person feels that they have enough help deciding how to use their budget or services, and if they get information about how much money is left for their budget or services. If the answer to this is a yes, then we go on to ask whether the person feels that that information is easy to understand. And finally, we have this question 74, which is just for the interviewer, and that's just asking to please indicate everyone who helped out with section 2, and that's just because we know that some individuals may not be answering questions, but may provide support or help with some of the questions throughout this section, and so we'd like to see everybody who took part in the meeting. And that brings us to the end of the consumer survey. We do have a few questions that are just for the interviewer. And those questions are here on this surveyor feedback sheet. There are just some basic questions about the survey itself, the survey process, how long it took to complete the face-to-face survey, how long it took to collect some of that background information, and whether there are questions that were particularly problematic for you. So whether you had difficulty asking or understanding what a question meant, that is what we're looking for here. Those suggestions that we get are really important in helping us keep up to date with the survey and make tweaks when necessary, so we appreciate your input here. And that really takes us to the end of this training. Thank you all so much for your attention, and thank you for listening.